So now let's talk about dominance in animal behavior, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about this, and it shapes how we frame problem behaviors and how the owners go and address them with their dogs. So what is dominance? Dominance is exerting influence or control over another, or in the case of animals, more specifically, it's having preferred access to resources. So there's been a myth that's gone on for decades now. It began a little bit more back in the 80s when there was a book published that looked at captive wolves who were completely unrelated to one another, and how there was a lot of resource guarding and squabbling and animals trying to get this access to resources and having dominance over the other ones. And it was assumed that this is how our dogs are, that there's one dog who is always the alpha and always the leader, and that the other ones have to submit to him, and that that's how this is in our home. And people took from that if their dog was showing some sort of dominance through aggression, challenging them by growling about access to a bone, or if they were being harsh with another dog in the house, that the owner needed to forcibly, both physically and psychologically, assert themselves as the alpha, as if there's this constant struggle going on between the owners and their dogs. So this really is a problem because it doesn't fit ethologically with what we understand dogs to be. There's been a lot of research, and in 1999, the guy who authored that book said, hey, I got it wrong. That's not how wolves in the wild behave. Captive wolves are different. They're not in that family structure, and this doesn't apply to dogs in our home. But for some reason, that hasn't really reached most of the trainers out there and most homes with the average owners. So people think that they're doing the right thing sometimes, that they are trying to keep their dogs from getting out of control when they go and they forcibly do some pretty damaging things to animals sometimes. The important thing to note, though, is that dominance it's not a label like a personality label. A dog is not always dominant. In ethology, like if we look at any of these papers that are authored specifically looking at dominant behavior in dogs, it's talking about very specific interactions in a specific context between two dogs. It's a one-time thing. It's not saying this dog is always dominant. That's who he is. It's saying that in this specific incident, this dog had preferred access to this particular resource. So if we misunderstand what dominance is, it can actually change about what we're seeing happening, because people will say, oh, he's just the alpha, so he always gets preferred access to things. But what really is going on is one dog's constantly bullying another, because sometimes I see this with dogs who have poor social skills or who are anxious, and they're being labeled as dominant, and owners are allowing this behavior to continue because they think there has to be a hierarchy that way in the home. And then if it gets really out of hand, they think that they need to be asserting themselves physically and psychologically, intimidating a dog or physically injuring them so that this dog won't challenge them and that they'll know their place in the house. But what we know is that dog-to-dog aggression exists in the home, sometimes with very significant injuries. So we're not saying that there aren't squabbles between dogs, but how do we address them? We've learned that this type of confrontational style of training is not the way to go. So dominance really isn't necessarily aggression. And by aggression, I talk about intent to actually cause physical harm to the other being. Most of the time, it's posturing. It can be a dog staring at another one, giving side eye, or the submissive dog might go on their back or turn their head away from the resource. It can be the ritualized aggression, like growling or the whiskers flaring forward. It's very rich communication if we know what we're looking for, and dogs are reading this between one another to negotiate access to resources. So in this popular misunderstanding about dominance, it's always about using aggression, but most of the time that's not what's actually happening. And the important thing to note is that humans are the leaders by default, similar to mom and dad. So Dr. Clive Wynn, who is the head of the Canine Science Collaboratory at Arizona State University, he's an ethologist and he's a psychology professor there. And he says that humans are by nature super dominant over dogs, because dogs are captive animals under human control. I know most people don't like to think about it that way. They think, hey, this is my best friend. I like to think that way too. But at the end of the day, dogs can't open the refrigerator and say, hey, I feel like eating now. And, I want to have steak for dinner. I don't want to have this kibble. Or I want to go have the car key so I can go and see my friends. They can't decide when they eat, what they eat, who they socialize with, when they socialize. They can't decide, hey, I'm not feeling so good. I'm going to make a vet appointment. We really have control over all of that. They're completely dependent on us. So, when they feel insecure about access to resources, maybe they're going to growl or they're going to do something to indicate, hey, I really want to keep this, but they're not becoming dominant over a human. It's really signs of insecurity, and it shows us that, hey, maybe we need to address this so that he feels safe giving up resources, or he feels safe when I approach and I come around. Really framing how we see this behavior shapes how we address it. Because if you go with a dog like that and you just try to intimidate them and, maybe yell at them or hit them, what we'll see later in some of these other slides, as I talk about some other studies, is that can trigger some very aggressive reactions out of dogs. And it's going to make them feel more anxious and more stressed because it harms that human and animal bond. So that's why it's important to understand what's actually happening with these this rich communication from dogs and why they're doing this. So insights from research, like there's been tons of different research over the years, especially in the last 10 years or so, looking at dominant behavior between different types of canids. And the insights that we've gleaned really vary based on what type of canid we're looking at, the context. Are they in captivity? Are they in the wild? It varies. And I think that's important to note, because if we're looking at wolves in the wild and how they behave, that's not really the same as looking at a dog who's in captivity, well, like in a home, but it's not the same. They don't have the same biological drives. They don't have the same family structure. They don't have any of that. And so it's important to look at the context of it. So the insights have really varied based on wolves in the wild, captive, unrelated wolves, if we're looking at free-ranging domesticated dogs, because they actually biologically are a little bit different with size and drives, those motor patterns they were bred for, versus purebreds, whether the animals in question are spayed or neutered versus intact. If there's a differing mix of males and females, because again, biological drives and how they relate to one another may change. And the age distribution, because we do sometimes see deference towards elderly dogs in some groups. And then also, are these pets living full times in homes with humans? And that's important to note, because people forget that over 80% of domesticated dogs worldwide don't live in homes. They actually live free-ranging. They may live in towns or near dumps. And so their behavior and their motor patterns they were bred for are very different versus some of these breeds we bred to do very specific tasks. So they have differing in predatory sequences intact and differing reactions to different stimuli. They may not be as strong as scavengers. All this really varies. But what we do know is that social and competitive dominance absolutely exists between dogs, but it's a little more fluid. Like, no dog is always the alpha in these situations. It's very situation or resource specific. It's good old-fashioned resource guarding. And this occurs because with the wolf family structure, that natural structure dictates the distribution of resources. It's age graded, where senior dogs get more preferential access, and it's also matrilineal. So the mother wolf, who's the mother of the breeding pair, mom and dad, get the deference, and then after that, the other wolves. And sometimes non-related wolves will join the pack, but they fall into this predetermined structure. It's not where there's this constant aggression and the struggle to see who is the alpha, like what was observed in captive unrelated wolves. With this, it's a natural order that when other ones join, they fall into this. Dogs that live in our homes, they don't fall into this predetermined structure. They don't understand when they're going to get access to resources, and one dog's not possibly allowing them to just have access because of their age. Sometimes we see that, sometimes we don't, but there's this it's a lot of different competition and a lot of different resources that they don't know how to navigate these situations unless we teach them. So it's important to note that even though wolves and dogs are the same species, canine lupus, they show very different behaviors than wolves regarding their biological family. With domesticated dogs, they have early sexual maturity as young as 6 months, as I'm sure you all know. And, it's very sad that sometimes we'll see 6-month-old dogs that have litters of puppies. But wolves, they sexually mature around 2 years old, and they have 1 litter per year, which is very predictable because it's in the springtime, since that gives the pups the greatest chance of survival. Dogs can have litters, up to twice per year, and they don't mate with just one other dog for life like wolves do. They typically mate for life. Female dogs may have multiple sires, with one litter in particular. And dogs will even mate with their immediate family. So if a breeder has a father and then a daughter, during that heat cycle, they need to keep them separated. Whereas with wolves, they don't do that. So there's a division of labor between wolf parents and other pack members, because this is crucial to survival. They all have to cooperate. Like dogs, they're primarily scavengers, but we've also bred them for other jobs, but they're not taking down large game where they have to coordinate with one another, and somebody needs to lead in order to make that happen. Wolves, they have to work together towards these common goals. So if a mother is nursing puppies, the father and some of the other wolves that are there will bring back food for her and for the puppies. We don't see dogs doing that. We see them trying to guard things from one another. Maybe they'll share on occasion, but they're not going to that level to help one another. Domesticated dog fathers too, they don't really stick around for the puppies necessarily. And if a breeder happens to have the father, sometimes they even need to keep them separated because the father may show aggression to the puppies, but they're definitely not helping to raise that litter. So what structure do domesticated dogs have? Because we know it's not the wild wolf structure. What we do know is it's more fluid, it's less strict, which means more competition, more squabbling for resources, unless we give them some love and direction through training to help them understand that they don't need to feel anxious about this. Because, wolves, they can go out and, they can work together and go get more food. They have more autonomy, even though they're out in the wild. But dogs, like domesticated dogs, they don't have that. They live within our homes, and all those resources come from us, and that can lead to a lot of anxiety if they don't feel that that's enough, or it's not meeting their needs, it's not predictable. So we need to teach them with socialization and training what to do when these resources are available and there's other dogs who want them. So what we do see is that there are age and sex-related difference, sometimes in pet homes, but not consistently. But it is observed in free-ranging dogs sometimes. That's the key, sometimes. But definitely in wolves. Like I mentioned with wolves, they tend to be matrilineal. And then we also see where the seniors get preferential access to these resources. In the free-ranging dog groups, we tended to see males getting preferential access. But if you look at the free-ranging dog groups, a lot of them aren't purebred. So with these free-ranging dogs, typically there's a little bit more size difference between the males and the females. Whereas with purebreds, there is a little size difference, but it's not so significant. And pet dogs, there was an owner survey done a couple years ago with lots of dogs. It was like, not a small sample size. And owners said that their spayed females exhibited more preferential access and also were smaller than the males in 59% of the homes. I found this interesting because we also have seen research showing spayed females having a little bit higher levels of aggression than intact females, and also more than male dogs. So I don't know if that comes into play. Really, there's a lot of unanswered questions when it comes to dominance in pet dog homes. So it's interesting to see more of this research come out. So free-ranging dogs, insights really depended on where those dogs lived and if they were purebreds who were just loose on the streets and now living in groups of dogs, or if they were village dogs, you know, the land race type breeds that have, have puppies over generations and generations and become their own group, like the Arabian village dogs or the Peruvian or Chilean dogs. It really depended, on where they were at. But what we do know is that they're not working cooperatively towards a common goal like wolves are. They're not working together to go hunt large game. They're living together and perhaps for protection, but their structure is for division of resources. So it's primarily based on age. So we do see deference towards older dogs, also towards dogs who have a larger body size, more intimidating, and also based on sex. We tend to see males getting a little bit more preferential access. And again, these dogs are not working towards a common goal, just like the dogs in our homes. They are not wolves. They are primarily scavengers. So they're finding food that people leave out in the garbage, or perhaps homes are feeding them, but they don't live in those homes with those people. For wolves, the cooperation is crucial to survival, feeding those who cannot feed themselves. We don't see that with these free-ranging dogs. They're not bringing food back for their friends. So what I found interesting was looking at wolf dogs. I went to the Wolfdog Sanctuary at Yamnuska last year in 2022. This is in Alberta, Canada, and I highly recommend it to anyone who can go. But it is a sanctuary for wolf dogs that people had gotten and thinking like, hey, it's cool to have a wolf, and then seeing wolfy behaviors come out that don't really make them conducive to living in a pet home. But they have a variety of different dogs. They have high content wolf dogs who have over 95% wolf in them and are typically crossed with a German Shepherd or a Malamute so that they keep that wolfy type appearance. But then there's also low content wolf dogs. And these may only have, 30% wolf in them. But what is interesting is that there are very different social behaviors between those dogs and how they interact with one another, and also how they interact with people. So I had some really great time interacting with the wolf dogs and talking with the staff about those observations, because they can't house high content wolf dogs very often with the low content ones, because the high content ones tend to follow that wild wolf type structure where there's a lot of same-sex aggression and where the elderly ones expect deference from the younger ones. But as we see in pet homes, that sometimes happens, but not always. And so the low content ones go and try to challenge, high content dogs like, hey, I want, first access to the food that's brought in here. And that wouldn't go so well. So the wolf dog who's in this photo, she was elderly. I think she may have been 12 years old, they said, but she's a female, and she was 95% wolf dog. 95% wolf, and she was crossed with German Shepherd, and they had her in an enclosure, which you can see a little bit of the other dog in the background. They paired her with an older male, and they kind of functioned as a pair, like mom and dad, even though they weren't actually breeding. But they also had two much younger wolf dogs who were high content living in there with them, and those dogs deferred to her for primary access to resources. So when I was in there, they gave us a bunch of foods and treats, and she was curious, wanting to come over and check us out, but not wanting interaction. She just wanted to check us out, and we tossed some of the food to her. We'll just kind of toss it out, but she was the one who came over, and the other one who was nearby waited in the wings. And at one point, he started to come over thinking she wasn't interested, and she kind of snarked at him like, hey, back off. And he totally respected that, and then eventually came over once she was no longer interested. So we got to see some of that at play, but these were all high content wolf dogs that followed that typical wolf structure, which they said they don't see with many of the low content wolves. So they have to be very careful about how they house them, because these animals, they don't fit into the wolf world, but they don't also fit into the domesticated dog world. So it's very difficult for them. So how can we have peaceful interactions? the biggest thing is to steer clear of labeling animals saying, well, this one's alpha or this one's dominant, because it really doesn't set up that animal for success. It puts them into a box behaviorally, and it doesn't look at why they're doing that. And it can write off some of the behaviors that are troublesome as well, saying, well, this one's just alpha, instead of realizing, hey, this one's actually anxious, or maybe this one has poor social skills, and maybe we need to work on teaching them how to behave in these different situations. So we need to look at why the animals are doing the behaviors in order to set them up for success. So there's a lot of opportunities here for pet parents and owners. Properly socializing dogs early is key. Sometimes I see people try to manage things too perfectly. They try to never have food out with multiple dogs. They feed them each in their crates. They don't have high value toys out. They don't bring out chew items. And if they do, the dogs have them in their crates. But the problem with that is that sometimes there's going to be situations where there's a resource that comes available. Maybe the human didn't know it was a resource because it's something that doesn't seem interesting, but to these dogs are like, whoa, we all want that. Or there's dropped food. You just never know. And if they're not taught to understand how to navigate those situations, that can lead to aggression. So I sometimes see that with dogs who have had everything so perfectly managed that once a situation arises that's novel, they jump on it and it leads to fights. So socialization with resources and with training is key. And we need to teach puppies to look to owners or the humans for those resources, because we're providing all those things. They don't need to view as, you know, I get what's available that I can fight for. So say, you know, both dogs have a bully stick, and one of them's chewing on it and accidentally knocks it under the couch. I want them to look to me to solve the situation and to provide another resource or to get that one from under there, rather than having that dog be like, well, there's still one out. My brother has it. I'm going to go take it from him, which could involve aggression. But even if it's not aggressive, it can create feelings of anxiety in the other dog if their things are being taken from them. So I like to teach puppies to look to the humans to get resources and to solve these sorts of situations so that it doesn't involve aggression. And it really helps them to feel secure and access to things. And I also teach behaviors to request resources. How do they let me know they want to play, or that they want to do agility, or that they're hungry and, you know, they want something? How do they let me know that? Most people, they don't really teach animals how to request those behaviors other than to go to the bathroom. They want them to let them know so they don't pee in the house. But it's really important for all different resources that they have a way to communicate with us, because dogs don't have that sense of agency. We manage in everything about their lives. They're really micromanaged. And if they have some influence over outcomes, that can help a lot with anxiety. The other thing that I wanted to note is that teaching puppies to look to the owners may be, I guess, a little bit abnormal for some of these dogs, because some of them were bred to work out away from humans. They were supposed to see a stimulus and immediately take action, not check in with the owner or the human, like, hey, how should I handle this situation? So I'm talking about guarding breeds, Mastiff breeds, livestock guardian dogs, some herding breeds. They're supposed to see a stimulus and then just rely on those motor patterns they were bred for to just take action. So we're really inserting ourselves in the middle here, teaching them, hey, look to me and I will solve this situation for you. So that's why it's so important, because animals think that, hey, humans think that, hey, if my animal trusts me, they're going to look to me for guidance. Not necessarily. It really depends on what dog you have, but you can teach this. The key is to do it very young, and to also do it closely managing every situation where these resources are out. Let's instruct them until it becomes second nature. And creating reliable routines can also help too, so they know when resources will come available, and to use reward-based training. We don't need to punish animals for feeling anxious or creating more fear and more stress. So this is another way that I like to drive home the effects of aversive interventions, because there are a lot of studies nowadays showing how using these confrontational interventions actually triggers aggression in these animals rather than trying to get rid of it. So there was a 2009 study that was conducted by a veterinary behaviorist looking at confrontational interventions versus reward-based. And it's just horrible to read, but people hit or kicked their dogs when they did an undesirable behavior. And 43% of the time that triggered aggression from the dog. People would physically force an animal to give up something out of their mouth. 39% of the time that triggered aggression. People would growl at their dog. They would stare the dog down. They would alpha roll the dog. And, you know, in large percentages, like there was aggression that came from these animals because they're stressed, they're fearful. And this isn't something that just occurs in that instance. Like, yes, there may be aggression in that instance, but what's happened is they've broken the trust between the animal and the human. Like, these are people that these animals have to live with and that they have to trust, and they've just, you know, abused them. So we have to look at why animals are doing the undesired behavior in order to figure out how to train them to do the things we want or to set them up for success, not try to, you know, dominate them, which is what I think a lot of this comes from, is people think that, hey, if a dog's doing this, I have to assert myself as the alpha, because of that myth where people felt like there's this constant struggle involving aggression and you have to assert yourself to be on top, but that's been debunked. So we really have to look at why animals are doing this. Because even as simply as yelling no often triggered dogs who had aggression towards familiar people into aggressive scenarios. And I've seen that in my own caseload where sometimes people yelled no, and then it triggered a fight between dogs, or it triggered a dog to going after the owner. But they also use reward-based training with another group of dogs in the studies, and that didn't elicit aggression in many dogs at all, as one would expect.